Ranged units in Clash Royale are an essential part of any well-rounded deck. Unlike melee troops that have to get up close to deal damage, ranged units can sit back safely and chip away at enemy troops and towers from a distance, making them absolutely essential for both offense and defense. An important thing to understand though is that range usually comes at the cost of some health, so each ranged unit in the game requires proper support, placement, and timing to get the best value and actually win you games. Today we're going through every ranged unit in Clash Royale, how to actually use them properly, avoid the rookie mistakes, and squeeze out every last bit of value to dominate on both offense and defense. Before we jump into the first ranged unit, here are a couple of general tips that'll be useful for almost any ranged unit you choose. First off is spacing. Since most ranged units are vulnerable to spells like the Fireball, Poison, and Lightning, you want to avoid grouping them together whenever possible. Placing your Musketeer and Wizard in the same spot is just asking for a massive negative trade when your opponent spells them all at once. Second, ranged units are typically glass cannons, meaning they deal high damage but have relatively low health. This means you almost always want to use them behind a tank or place them defensively where they can get support from your tower. And with all that out of the way, let's jump into the first ranged unit. Spear Goblins are one of the cheapest and most versatile ranged units in the game. At only 2 elixir, you get 3 Spear Goblins that can target both ground and air troops from a distance, making them incredibly flexible for both offense and defense. The key to Spear Goblins is understanding that they're a cycle card. You're not looking for them to get massive value on their own, but rather to provide cheap, consistent chip damage and air defense while cycling back to your win condition. On defense, Spear Goblins are amazing at kiting. Since they're cheap and ranged, you can use them to pull troops like the Prince into the center of the arena where both your towers can target them. They're also great against air troops like the Balloon, as with the help of something like an Ice Spirit or a Snowball, they can fully take it out. The biggest weakness of Spear Goblins is that they die to literally everything. Zap, Log, Snowball, you name it. This means if your opponent has any spell and cycle, your Spear Goblins are basically cooked, but if they don't have a cheap 2 elixir spell, they'll likely be getting bad trades, which can help you build up an elixir advantage. Spear Goblins can work really well as a log bait card, since if you play them at the bridge, your opponent will usually log them so they can also chip your tower at the same time, and then you can punish with a Goblin Barrel or Skarmy. Spear Goblins can also be used to cycle quickly when you're trying to get back to your win condition. Since they only cost 2 elixir, you can drop them in the back or at the bridge to speed up your cycle without committing too much elixir. When played at the bridge, your opponent will either have to defend them efficiently or take the chip damage. An interesting tip when playing the Spear Goblins is that you can place them on this tile called the bypass placement, and it will actually allow 1 extra hit compared to playing them directly at the bridge. Archers are the more reliable and spell resistant cousins of the Spear Goblins. At 3 elixir, you get 2 ranged units that can target both ground and air, and they have just enough health to survive zap and most other cheap spells, making them way more consistent. Obviously, this means the arrows are the perfect counter for them, so if your opponent is running those, you'll need to be careful about making sure they don't have them in cycle if you want to get good value. The archers are actually a great first play of the game if you have them in your starting hand, as you can split them in the back to subtly deny both lanes and also create a small threat, since a lone archer crossing the bridge will get a shot off. Then your opponent will most likely feel forced to play something quickly so that you don't build an early lead on them while they leak elixir. The key to the archers is positioning. Since they have decent range and health, you'll again want to split the archers either in the back or further forward to minimize spell value for your opponent. On defense, archers are amazing at dealing with tanks and air troops. Drop them in the center to pull and chip away at a Prince or Mini P.E.K.K.A. while your towers help finish them off. They're also great against swarms. Since there are 2 of them, they can take out something like the Skeleton Army pretty efficiently if given enough time. On offense, archers work best as support behind a tank. Drop a Giant or Royal Giant, then place your archers behind it. They'll chip away at whatever your opponent uses to defend while your tank soaks up the damage. Alternatively, if you split the archers to discourage logs or arrows from your opponent, they'll often focus on the supported side and leave the lone archer to get a sneaky shot in. You can take this one step further by placing a miner last second on the tower, as this will be very irritating for them to defend while your main push is threatening their other tower at the same time. The Goblin Gang is one of the best value cards in the entire game when used correctly. At 3 elixir, you get 5 goblins total, 3 with spears that can hit air and 2 with knives that only hit ground. This makes them incredibly versatile for both offense and defense. The option to hit both ground and air makes the gang very effective at stopping something like a Lumberloon push for a positive trade. The key to the Goblin Gang is understanding that while they are a good bait card, your opponent would be getting a +1 trade by logging them, so it's usually better to use something cheaper as bait and then use the gang when they don't have a log and will have to commit more elixir to defend it. On defense, the Goblin Gang is great against tanks, as the 5 goblins combined deal massive DPS, which means they can take out a Giant or Royal Giant surprisingly fast if left unchecked. The biggest weakness of the Goblin Gang is that when played at the bridge, they can be completely countered by any 2 elixir spell or the arrows, which are all good trades for your opponent, so usually you'll want to split them in the back or play them defensively out of log range so they can be more of a nuisance to deal with. The Goblin Gang can completely counter the graveyard for a positive elixir trade. Just drop them on top of the graveyard and the goblins will take out the skeletons before they can do much damage. Similar to the archers, the Goblin Gang can be a good first play of the match split in the back so that your opponent feels pressure to act quickly and avoid you stacking up a big push early. The Dark Goblin is one of the fastest attacking ranged units in the game, and when left unchecked, he can do a ton of chip damage and take towers outright if tanked for. At 3 elixir, the Dark Goblin has insane attack speed and decent range, making him great for both that chip damage and melting high high HP troops on defense. The key to the Dark Goblin is keeping him alive. He won't die to a Zap, Rage, or Snowball, but he will die to the Log, which is a positive trade for your opponent, so you really should only let that happen if you're using him as bait. He's a great counter to the Balloon, just drop him quickly and he'll take it out before it can get close to your tower. The Dark Goblin has a pretty long range, so between that and his quick movement speed, your opponent has to react very quickly when you use him at the bridge if they don't want to take a hit or two. This can be even more effective if you place him instantly at the start of the match when he's in your hand, since your opponent hasn't even gotten their bearings yet and you'll instantly pressure them into responding to not fall behind. The nice part on defense is that even something as simple as skeletons to distract can allow him to take out something as strong as the elite barbarians for a great elixir trade. The Dark Goblin's long range lets him outrange the bomb tower, inferno tower, and cannon, and any building that is placed 4 tiles or less from the river can be picked off from your side of the arena, which is really effective for letting a fast win condition like a Hog Rider through to the tower. The Princess is probably the best chip damage card in the entire game. This is because she connects to the tower very quickly when placed, and since she sits on your side of the arena, she'll just completely take a tower on her own if not addressed, unlike something like the Dark Goblin that could technically be ignored if you're low on elixir. At 3 elixir, she has the longest range of any troop in the game, which allows her to chip the tower from your side like I just mentioned, but also allows her to provide great swarm clear from the very back, meaning your opponent is forced to use specifically the arrows to counter her. It can also use the miner, but any other spell or viable counter will be a negative trade for them. The key to the Princess is understanding that she's all about forcing your opponent to respond. Every time you play her, they either have to use a spell to take her out or send troops across the bridge to deal with her. The Princess is not only great at clearing swarms from a safe distance on defense, but also at supporting your pushes from your side of the arena. Just drop her at the bridge behind your push and she'll clear out Skarmies and bats with ease, or even something like a minion horde if you buy her enough time. The biggest counter to the Princess is the Log, since it's a positive elixir trade that completely takes her out. It's not the easiest thing for the average player to react before taking one shot from the Princess, but an experienced player will likely log her instantly, leaving them with a +1 trade and also a little bit of chip damage on your tower. You'll want to watch out for players with the Magic Archer in their deck, because this can be placed right in front of the Princess, and whether he's played quick enough to distract her or not, he'll take her out while simultaneously chipping your tower. A unique strategy with the Princess is to place her at the bridge on the opposite side of your push to trick them into wasting a log or something else on her, since they'll react instinctively, leaving them more exposed to the main push. The Firecracker is one of the most annoying and effective range units in the game when used correctly. At 3 elixir, she has a long range and her attacks knock her backward, which can allow her to dodge spells at the last second, switch lanes completely, and more depending on what she's attacking. On defense, the Firecracker is amazing at clearing swarms. Her splash damage takes out the skeleton army, Goblin Gang, or minions in just one shot. She's also great at chipping away at tanks, while her splashback damage wrecks any support troops behind it. One important thing to note about her damage is that all 5 pieces of shrapnel are what cause her main damage, with the splashback just being a spread out version of that. In other words, the rocket itself doesn't actually do any damage, but the closer something is to the impact, the more pieces will hit them, creating the illusion of impact damage. The downside to her splash damage is that your opponent can activate their king tower in a number of different ways. It's as easy as placing pretty much anything in the middle a few tiles back from the river, so be very careful unless you're using something like a Royal Giant deck where king activations don't affect you much. One way you can prevent this is by hovering a tornado when she crosses the bridge, so that you can quickly move the troop out of the way and closer to their crown tower if they place it, but the timing on this can be tricky and sometimes you'll need to outright predict to even pull it off. Like the archers and princess, the Firecracker's biggest counter is the arrows, since it's an even trade and will take her out no questions asked. The arrow's large radius makes it hard to miss her even with her knockback, but keeping her close to your king tower can make it really annoying for your opponent, since they have to time their arrows to avoid her pushing back into the king tower and out of range at the last second. On offense, the Firecracker works really well as an addition to almost any push, as she has the versatility to take out a lot of different defensive troops or buildings. The Ice Wizard's one of only a few cards in the game that can slow things down. At only 3 elixir, he deals low damage but slows down every troop he hits, making him incredibly valuable for stalling pushes and slowing down the tempo of a match. Similar to the Electro Wizard's zap effect upon placing him, the Ice Wizard will deal area damage when placed, as well as slowing things down a bit right off the bat. This is admittedly a bit harder to use than it is with the Electro Wizard, since the Ice Wizard has even less health, so you'll mostly want to use this on top of building targeting units that won't fight him back, or to take out weaker units like the bats or skeletons with that bigger splash radius and then set up for a counter push. The key to the Ice Wizard is understanding that he's not about damage, he's about control. You're using him to slow down your opponent's push so your other troops and towers can finish them off, or to slow down their defensive troops and buy your win condition more time to get to the tower. He's also one of the cheapest splash damage dealing troops in the game, so you won't be overspending by using him to clean up a Skarmy or Goblin Gang, and you can get even better trades against something like a minion horde. The biggest weakness of the Ice Wizard is that he deals very low damage, so he can't defend many things alone aside from swarms. He will also just barely die to an equal level fireball, but this is obviously a negative trade for your opponent since he's so cheap. He can be especially devastating to air troops, since a lot of them are already decently slow to begin with, and his slow effect will only make things even worse, allowing even something as simple as the archers to take on some pretty formidable air pushes with his help. The Ice Wizard actually has really nice synergy with a graveyard, as he's a pretty cheap option to tank and slow down the tower, which will allow the skeletons to really build up and get some insane value if not handled correctly by your opponent. The Musketeer is probably one of the oldest and most reliable ranged units in the entire game. At 4 elixir, she has solid health, good range, and high DPS, making her effective on both offense and defense. She has enough health to survive a fireball like some other troops in her price range, and this means that your opponent will need something stronger like a lightning to completely take her out when she's defending their push. That is if you placed her well, as if she's placed in log range, a fireball log combo will take her out and get some good chip damage on your tower, so don't give your opponent that opportunity unless you really have to place her there. On defense, the Musketeer is amazing at taking out air troops. She completely shreds balloons, baby dragons, and even lava hounds if given enough time. She's also great against tanks. Her high DPS means she can chip away at giants or golems from a safe distance while your other troops help out. This can be especially effective if a cheap building like the tombstone or cannon is used to kite incoming tanks to the middle, which buys your Musketeer much more time to work on their health. Be careful with this though, as if your opponent has a lightning spell, you'll need to place your Musketeer strategically to avoid them getting the building and Musketeer at the same time, but once you felt out their deck and know they don't have a lightning, you don't need to worry about that. On offense, the Musketeer works best as support behind a tank. Something like a giant usually works well, but this push is very vulnerable to swarms, so you either have to have spells ready or use something like an ice golem or electro giant that have aura damage of some kind to help with swarms. A more popular pairing is actually with the Hog Rider. Drop your hog at the bridge, then place your Musketeer right behind it, and she'll take out whatever your opponent uses to defend while your hog gets to the tower. Because of the Musketeer's solid range, she's a good option to place in the pocket when you've already taken a tower, as this will force a quick reaction from your opponent and can be used to clutch a quick victory in overtime or simply to deal a few hits of chip damage. Zappies are one of the most annoying and effective stun cards in the game when used correctly. At 4 elixir, you get 3 ranged units that have a relatively slow movement speed and attack speed, but they each have a ranged zap attack that does a bit of damage and stuns the target. Like other cards that stun, the Zappies are able to completely trivialize cards like the Inferno Dragon and Sparky, since even just one of them will do a lot of resetting, but all 3 can effectively stun lock some troops. The key to Zappies is understanding that they're all about disruption and countering ramp up damage. They won't be your main damage dealer on the tower, but they are great on offense and as support for tanks, which are more vulnerable to cards like the Inferno Tower. The biggest weakness of the Zappies is that they die to the fireball for an even trade, but with this particular card, this honestly works out in your favor a lot of the time. That's because if you want to use them as fireball bait, you can group them all together and your opponent will most likely take the shot, but if you want them as versatile defenders or as support for a split lane push, you can easily split them in the back and deny your opponent that value. The Zappies can be a great defensive option for the balloon, like most ranged troops, because they deal enough damage and stun long enough to take it out with the help of the tower. The Zappies are a great card to use with the graveyard, as they can be effective at baiting out poison spells, as well as the fact that if even just one of them gets to the tower with your graveyard, this can be insanely powerful since it'll survive long enough to retarget the tower onto your skeleton so it can keep zapping and help them build up. The Furnace is one of the most unique ranged units in the game. Had I done this series about 6 months ago, the Furnace would have made it into my buildings video, but in August of 2025, it was reworked to be a moving troop with a decent attack range as well as the ability to spawn fire spirits every 7 seconds. Since the Furnace can now technically stay alive indefinitely due to being a troop instead of a building, keeping it alive for as long as possible is the best way to get more value, similar to other spawning units like the Witch and Night Witch. On both offense and defense, the Furnace is great at clearing swarms. The fire spirits can take out the skeleton army, Goblin Gang, or minions on either side of the bridge, which makes the Furnace a solid addition to any push with a tank in it. Due to it spawning spirits every 7 seconds, it's a good idea to place it in the back when possible, and then place your tank at the bridge rather than the other way around, as this will allow it to build up a couple of spirits and deter your opponent from defending with their swarms. The Furnace will not die to the fireball, so if he can be kept back on your side for a long time, he will just keep getting value with his spirits and ranged attack unless your opponent's willing to commit to something like a lightning spell to take him out. The Furnace also pairs well with the Hog Rider, as he can be a great counter to a lot of common defensive cards used to stop the Hogs, such as the Tombstone and Skeleton Army. The Hunter is pretty unique compared to other ranged troops in the game. This is because his weapon does more damage the closer a target is to him when he fires, since his projectiles spread out and can mostly miss if the target is far away. Placing him directly on top of a tank like the Royal Giant will always be the best play, since he'll be able to dish out massive damage quite quickly unless he's dealt with. The nice part about his projectile spread though is that you can purposely place him far away from swarms like the Skeleton Army so that he can spread out his damage and deal with them more effectively. On offense, the Hunter can actually be pretty effective. If your opponent is smart with their defensive placements, they can render him less effective, but his projectile spread works perfectly when locked onto the tower since it's a large target, and he'll do a lot of damage that way. Yet again, the Hunter is another card that can absolutely destroy the Balloon or Lava Hound. Just place him as close to the incoming troop as possible so he can maximize his damage. The Hunter is one of the few ranged units that can actually fully counter a center placed Goblin Barrel. This is done by placing the Hunter just below the incoming barrel a bit before it lands. This timing can be tricky, so it'll take some practice to get right, but there are better Goblin Barrel counters out there if you can't get it. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to see how to use every air troop, click this video.